looking back at last week, the overflow of wealth, and we were in Second Corinthians chapter 8 and 9. That is the largest chunk of teaching about giving in the New Testament. And it is profound because not once does Paul mention the word money, and not once does he mention an amount, but rather he says we need to test our generosity or test our sincerity of our love and our faith against the Macedonians, and then even more test our sincerity against Jesus, who was rich but made himself poor. So I thought I'd kind of jump in. There's a few other things that I wanted to talk about, but we'll get to them a little later because it's such a huge passage. I probably could have we probably could have been in this passage for the next 3 or 4 weeks and still not gotten to the end of it. But I thought I'd bring up some nuances. But maybe right out of the gates, because of it was such a large passage, chapters 8 and 9. Was there anything that kind of stood out for you guys? And maybe I'm doing this in reverse rather than asking you questions, just kind of asking you, is there anything that stood out in the message? Or was there anything that stood out even in the actual passage itself? Second Corinthians chapter 8 and 9.
I'll let you go ahead, Brian.
Okay, well, yeah,
Paul
definitely the
mentioned
fact that it's so much about attitude, our heart, not about the amount that we give. That came out loud and clear, and definitely spoke to me. And the one statement you made, Peter, that if our giving doesn't change the way we live, then we're probably not giving sacrificially. That caused a lot of thought, eh, and definitely, definitely is something that is very true.
I think that the ability, the giving that it was something they gave freely and willingly, and I guess as we had a couple baptisms not that long ago, and I've been talking about baptism with other people as well. There's a part of baptism that's really about giving yourself, and there should be a joyful giving of yourself to Christ. And it's a complete, you think about what you do in baptism, or what you do in in conversion. You're giving yourself to Christ, which is really more than any, you are worth more than any sum of money that you will have ever given in your life. So you give yourself, and you give yourself so joyfully and freely. And but if it extends even to money and material goods, then I think that's really a sign of the Holy Spirit at work. Where the Holy Spirit is at work, there's this freedom and this joyful response. There's a joyful, well, it's what we've been talking about, the abundance and overflow. And the message caused me to think about in my life, because there are areas where I am a very joyful giver of myself or my time. And there are times when I'm a very joyful giver, but there are also times or areas where other areas where maybe I can be a bit stingy. And so thinking about how could God be touching my life in a way, or how do I need to maybe recognize, that where there's not joy in giving, or where there's a reluctance in giving of myself or my time and my money, that's an opportunity for renewal in that area. There's an opportunity to for the power of God to change me in that area too. And he already has changed me in certain areas, but I think there's plenty others. I was really just thinking about the freeness of their giving, which was a huge encouragement to Paul. Yeah.
And that was what Paul said we should compare ourselves to. He doesn't kind of like give a number or like a percentage that sometimes we think of about, but much more about sacrificially, like Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
but also
Yep.
even the people that he compares them, like the Macedonians, what said, they gave beyond and things like that, and they were eager to give, or even like the widow and the mite, giving the two mites. Jesus said, wow, she's given sacrificially. Now, with that in mind, kind of, maybe I should ask you guys towards the end. I said, here are some guidelines about how to decide where we give and how much we give. And so maybe I might just ask you guys the question, like, how have you guys unpacked that in your life? How much to give and where to give, right? And we can talk a little bit about the tithe. Like I said, it's really interesting that Paul doesn't even mention the tithe, and yet I do believe that the law was fulfilled, the law was not nullified, and so the intention of the law still remains. uh, so unpack that for me a little in your life, that idea of where to give and how to give and how much to give.
It's certainly easier for me. I think before I had a wife and kids to be a little bit more.
Blame the wife and kids, huh?
Yeah.
Throw them under the bus.
I'm not saying it was better. Not at all saying it was better, but I was saying it's easier because, you can think of yourself, and it can be easy to sacrifice yourself or to give of yourself. But when there's other people who are looking to you and depending on you, and you are required to also provide for them, then it's like, okay, so now there's two really good things, and what should come first? And I think that the question of, I only bring that up just because the truth of being a Christian is that we have an awful lot of good opportunities. We're in a world that is constantly in need. We know people who are constantly in need. Christ said, you'll always have the poor and the needy among you. And so there's always opportunities there. Sometimes they come into our lives uninterrupted. These opportunities are not uninterrupted, unexpected. And there's opportunities for spontaneous kind of generosity. And it's a good thing that we have a lot of opportunity, but it also can be a challenging thing. You can feel overwhelmed, like, oh, where do I give? And in the sea of need, my little drop in the bucket doesn't seem to be much. So it's really important to have our eyes on God, following him and hearing him first. And I actually had somebody tell me about my prayer life, which is related. They said, if you're unsure, if you're struggling in your prayer life, you need to start asking God to tell you what to pray for, or to lead you into what to pray for of all the needs. And I think it's this, and he said that was like rocket fuel for his personal prayer life, and he wanted to share that with me. I think it's the same thing with giving. If you know your limits, and I think if you're a wise steward, you should be pretty aware of your your own resources, how much you have, time and money to give. Because if you are giving, there's a way in which if you're giving beyond that, you're not actually being wise. But where do you put that? You got to walk that out with the Lord. You really do. I think that probably the majority of what you give should be directed. It should be touching people who are around you. Like, it should be, this is a larger discussion, but it should be local church, so you can fulfill those one another's. It should be local needs, because that's the community that you're in. And I mean, yes, you can give overseas too, but I think, as just a side note in terms of like beyond just saying, well, follow your spirit, follow the Spirit of God, I think that probably that will look like taking care of the needs that are right in front of you physically, or right in your community. I think that's how it will start, or it will probably look more like that and less like sending thousands of dollars. And not to say, but that's between you and the Lord as well. So those are some of my thoughts.
That's good. Like you said, it's always a bit of a challenge and trying to discern God's will. I know for myself, my Tara and I, each year we try to challenge ourselves to grow in our giving, and often we set an amount first. Not that there isn't some wiggle room for something that kind of comes up, but each year we kind of sit there and say, we're going to give this amount I know, at the beginning of my journey as a Christ follower, it started with the tithe, right? That 10%. I think it's a good place to consider beginning. After all, that was the Old Testament. We're not bound by that. I want to kind of continue to say that we're not bound by that, but we do give sacrificially. And each year we kind of look at what we have and decide, can we up it a little? And then after that, we kind of go through the process of where does it go? As of late, we've kind of have a little bit of a slush fund where we can give to anything and everything that we feel led to. But it also is kind of one of those things where it really refines you a little. We can't give to every organization. There's lots of great organizations and lots of great causes and stuff like that. But we try to keep ourselves to a certain number of causes and organizations. And of course, as you had said, Caleb, our first part goes to the church. Our first tenth for sure goes to the church because we do want to bless the worship of the fuel, the worship of the people. We want to grow in our one another's, and we want to grow in our fellowship. That was a big portion of what the tithes went to, was kind of fueling the worship of the nation and the fellowship of the nation around God. And so we definitely want to be part of that. And so that's kind of, I know how we've done it. We kind of almost set an amount, and then we kind of then see which ministries and where we want to have them a good or most impact the best we can, praying through it. So what about you, Brian?
Yeah, I would agree. For most of our married life, it's been the first 10% goes to the local church, and after that, it's child sponsorship or special needs and causes. And and yeah, and I find very important for us has been that it's right off the top. We don't wait and see what's left at the end of the month, then and then decide if we can afford to support the church or other causes. So it comes off the top. It's right away, and we've tried to teach our kids that when they were younger, any money that they got, 10% would be for offering, 10% for savings, and 80% they were allowed to spend however they wanted to. And it's interesting to watch your kids how one of our kids wanted to give 80% to the church or to special needs. That was kind of they loved that. So you can see that some have that more built in, others have to be trained more to become cheerful givers. So, and about the tithe, like, yeah, I don't think we're bound by it, but I was thinking about what one scripture you read on Sunday, Peter, where I think it's in Luke chapter 11, where Jesus confronts the scribes and Pharisees and says, you give 10% of everything, but you neglect other things. And he says there's don't neglect the former, the tithe, right? So even Jesus said, yeah, tithe is good. It's a good principle, a good start anyway. And then beyond that, your free will offering and everything else that goes with it.
Absolutely. Like I said, Jesus doesn't deny the tithe, but we're not bound by it. And I like what you said, like, in all budgeting, I think it really is that the giving comes out first, right? Like, give, save, spend. And the world gets it upside down, right? Like they sit there and it's like spend, save, and if you have anything left over, you can give. And I think that's a recipe for disaster. You'll never have enough to spend. Everything kind of short changes. But when you set aside right away, that's biblical. First fruits, always first fruits, right? Like in the Old Testament, it talks about first fruits. You give, you save, and then you figure out what you can spend. And that's a good principle. Um, One of the things that I thought was interesting, and I never really talked about it, was in Second Corinthians chapter 9, it talks about sowing and reaping, the benefits and blessings. And this has often been a passage used by the prosperity gospel. That's hey, you give $10 and you'll get $100 back and things like that. But if you really, really look at the analogy, we are sowing seed, we're reaping fruit. And those are different. That the blessings that come out of it is very different than what you sow into it. And so it's not necessarily that you don't want to sow seed and get seed. You sowing seed so you can get fruit, and there's going to be greater fruit in your life, and that can look like material blessings, but it could look like a lot of other stuff, right? That idea of being um, part of something bigger and better than you could ever imagine. Can you guys think of something like that? Like when you think about sowing and then reaping, what are some of the things that have reaped in your life? After all, that's what Jesus told his disciples. You've left family and homes. You're going to reap 100 times in this lifetime. And I don't think he's thinking just money. What have been some of the fruit that have been reaped in
Yeah.
your life by being willing to sow?
Go ahead, Brian. I know you've got a good answer for this.
Okay. Well, one thing is that there is a freedom, there's a peace, and
Mhm.
it's kind of something internal, an internal blessing. Um, the more the more I'm willing to live my life with open hands, so to speak, and be generous with time, with resources, with money, with everything, there's more joy and peace in my life, and I can trust in God without having to trust in money. There's a feeling that I have enough, I don't need more. There's more contentment with less. So those are, I think, wonderful blessings that probably will prolong my life because I won't get an ulcer. So there's a freedom there, um, that people, or that I, earlier in life, when money was more of a god in my life, um, there was also more worry and other things that went with it. So that's a great fruit, a great blessing.
How many people at the end of their lives say, I regret being at work so much. And it's just a reflection of the fact that, it doesn't pay the dividends that we thought it would pay. And I would agree with you, Brian, that, some of those blessings are really the freedom and joy that kind of come out of it. Caleb, you were about to chime in.
Oh, I just was going to say, um, I think Brian hit the nail on the head in that if you are following, if you have in your conscious, in your inner being, you can honestly say that you have responded, with generosity in, and at the base of that has been, God, I trust you. I'm trusting you. There is a huge piece that comes with that. To be able to say, I did. Like I and it follows you when you have the ups and downs of your circumstances. You can fall back on the fact that I actually, like, I was trusting God, and with that comes a great peace. But the other thing is provision, because I can look at my own life and I think about, I mean, there are people who give certainly far, far more than we do. Um, but what we give is not inconsequential either. And we're here with food on the table, with children who seem to be very responsive to the Lord, and um, certainly are needing to grow, but they're growing, and we have a great deal of peace and contentment in our marriage. And I find a deep satisfaction in some of the things that I get to do with my life. And it becomes like, man, I don't know that I would ever want to go back and take that back. Like, I don't think I have any regrets about the times when I've been generous, about what I've given. When I think about what else I could have done with it, like and sometimes it's mysterious to think about, like, how are we still, like, putting it on the table, like, how, but we're never worried about it, and it doesn't look like we have lots of buffer sometimes, um but you've got that great deal of peace. And and you can't put a price on that. Like there are people who I think would really long for even just a day of what sometimes we can experience through the peace of Christ. It's a really hidden sort of blessing that is, it's known to those who have walked that path.
Thank you for sharing that. And it just reminded me like that we do need to share stories like this, that testimonies are amazing. And this is one area that I think our culture has done a disservice for us. And what I mean by that is that, money is often a very private subject. Nobody talks about it. And I'm not saying, we need to, air out all of our everything, but often we don't talk about it. And because we don't talk about it, it has um, certain power or certain thing around it. And so it's great to be able to speak about it more openly. And I think that's where the church ought to move more towards. And so maybe I could ask, we've mentioned a little bit about it, but one of the things that Paul said was that the goal was equality. And what I took it to mean was, who are you comparing yourself to? If you're comparing yourself to the Jonesies and always wanting the next thing, it's going to be very different than if we are truly a community and sharing how we are growing, sharing needs and things like that, and then reflecting that. That's going to look differently. So, how do we, as a church, grow in equality and a true sense of equality, trying to consider the needs of others? Are there areas that we could grow in to, fulfill what Paul is pushing us towards, equality? Any kind of thoughts that come to your mind?
Well, I think there's definitely some room for growth when it comes to equality with some of the people probably that attend our church, are connected through relationships with people in our church where we maybe are not quite aware of what the needs are. But I think there's a willingness here to share and help whenever there's a Facebook post about someone that's in need. There's usually response from people in the congregation that are willing to help with that need. And I do think this is where our international partnerships come in too, because I mean, in Canada, even the poor people here are richer than the majority of people in many parts of the world. And so I really think that we have a responsibility there as well to do what we can for more equality, for needs being met, like with our Rwandan partners, for example.
It's a knowledge thing. I think that generally the heart is there, um, but yeah, it can be hard to always know what those needs are and what those opportunities are for equality. And sometimes people who are needing that help, sometimes they can be hesitant to share as well. Um, uh, and there's a thing about community. This maybe is a little bit adjacent to the subject, but there's a thing about community where you have to believe that you're a part of the community, and you can kind of look for cues from the outside, but the more that you choose to believe it, the faster and the more deeply I think you're going to experience community. If you're waiting for the cues to drop that tell you, yes, I am a part of this community, and you can, and maybe you shouldn't be necessarily blind to those, or if they're not there. But if you're waiting for those, then you might always be a little bit hesitant, and you might hold yourself back from engaging in a way that helps others know you and makes you known and makes your needs known. If you believe, no, this is my community, and I'm all in. Other people will adjust to that reality, and you'll find yourself there, known, and receiving help that maybe you might not have had otherwise. And that's a different conversation. But the flip side of that is something that I have to pray for. Is seeing the people around you. you have to see and you have to know, and that takes an ongoing effort to know your community, to know the people around you, and to know what are the needs and how can we make sure that we're being fair or we're being equitable in addressing needs in a community.
I think this is where life groups come in too, because when I think of the people that are committed to a weekly meeting with a small group of people, it's virtually impossible to hide your needs there. They'll come out, especially if it's a group where there's trust with one another, and then those needs can be met. And if the group can't meet the needs, then the group can look outside of the group to look who can meet that need. So that's that community connection. So then the needs are being brought up.
Right on, Brian. I think that was exactly true. And just like, how are we actually connected into the community? And love that comment, Caleb, about seeing and knowing your community. This has been an amazing and very encouraging conversation with you guys. I have learned a lot. Just wondering if there's anything else that kind of, on your hearts or on your minds this week.
You got to give yourself to the Lord first. That's something that is in the text first. They gave themselves to the Lord.
Yes.
And if you can, I think giving out of, you've said it before, Peter, and it's a quote from someone else, that your wallet is often the last thing to get sanctified. So if you want to get there, if you want to get to a generous mindset and receive all the benefits of that, you got to start by giving yourself to the one who made you and gave himself for you. And you got to do that first thing in the morning. As soon as your eyes wake up, God, I give myself to you today. And if you can win that battle, I think the domino is just going to keep falling, and you'll be in really, really good shape.
I think you're absolutely right, Caleb. That idea, again, we've talked about it. Generosity or overflow cuts through all of the resources in our lives. And often, as you said, maybe our wallet is one of the last things to be sanctified. But overflow, abundance, that generosity, it cuts across everything. And for some, different resources have more hold upon us than others. And, but it's interesting that Jesus and pretty much all the writers of the Bible spend a lot of time around wealth, possessions, and money, realizing just how much of a hold it can actually have on us. Any additional thoughts, Brian?
Nope. Sounds really good.
All righty. I think that's about a wrap. Thanks for joining us for Living in the Scriptures Live. Blessings. We'll see you next week.
That's good.